Hello and welcome to Face, our weekly review of top events that matter most for Poland, Ukraine and Central Europe. I'm Anna Kalczyńska and joining me is Adam Jasser, News Director at TVP World. Good evening, Adam.
Hello.
Hello. So a lot of Ukraine diplomacy and statement this week. President Trump criticized both Russia and Ukraine for dragging their feet on his effort to put an end to this war. Russia, meanwhile, keeps attacking Ukrainian cities. So what is the state of play, let's put it this way?
It's sometimes hard to really know what's going on because we hear a lot of public statements by everybody. But we do not necessarily know what's going behind the scenes and what is the state of negotiations. What we do know is that Trump is getting impatient because he promised that there will be peace in Ukraine. Well, forget about his promise to get it done in one day, but seriously speaking, he promised to get it done within 3 months, within the first 100 days of his presidency. And this is about to finish that first 100 days, and obviously the peace is not there. Mm-hmm. So he's impatient, and this was communicated very clearly by him, and it was communicated also by J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, and by Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. So the Americans are basically saying, you know, unless both parties, both sides agree to what we're proposing, we're ready to walk away. Whether that is part of the pressure or whether they're seriously considering walking away, that's something we will find out.
Exactly. But, well, first we hear about Crimea, which should be a signal that Trump is really serious about the first and most important concession on the side of Ukraine to be made. And that would constitute walking away from Crimea Declaration, which, let me remind you, pledged that a non-recognition policy would remain until Ukraine's territorial integrity is restored. That would be annulled, I imagine. So do you think that Crimea is lost?
We have to distinguish between two issues. One is the situation on the ground, the practical matter of who controls territory at the moment, and what is the legal status of any of the captured lands, including Crimea. And Trump, as usual, is ambiguous about that, because he says, on the one hand, Crimea is Russian, but then he is also saying nobody is forcing Ukraine to accept the legality of that takeover.
So could you please tell me, what do you make of it? Because this is very complicated.
I think Trump is basically acknowledging publicly that Russian control of Crimea in terms of holding to that territory cannot be reversed by military means. So he's basically sticking to his line that Ukraine hasn't got the manpower and hasn't got the military power to take Crimea back. So
as of today.
As of today. So he's saying, please, everybody, recognize that reality. Mr. President Zelensky recognized that reality.
And he might be right in the sense that the reality in the ground is that for last 3 years, the Ukrainians were not able to kick off the Russians from their territories.
But the bigger issue looms there, and you're right to point out that the real question is, does that mean the United States is prepared to recognize the Russian annexation of Crimea or any other occupied territories? Because that would be a departure from international law, from traditional American policy. But I think the Americans are ambiguous about that. And, you know, at the end of the day, we have to remember, and we had a number of guests in our own studio here telling us that the best blueprint for what might happen when it comes to peace in Ukraine is Korea, after the Korean War in the 50s of the previous century. So a ceasefire, demarcation, and in fact lack of a peace treaty going on until today. But so their argument is that for Ukraine the key element is to stop the hemorrhage that the war is causing to Ukraine as well. It's causing huge losses to Russia, but Ukraine is bleeding really hard. So first it stops the war and it allows Ukraine to rebuild. And I think, this is really important because before this conversation about the future of Crimea and the status of Crimea, we had the discussion about other conditions that Putin was allegedly putting on the whole thing. Namely, no NATO, possibly no European Union membership, but also...
Demilitarization.
Exactly, you're absolutely right, demilitarization. And we heard from Washington this week that this is not going to be part of the solution, that Ukraine will be able to maintain strong military, rearm itself and all of that. So that again brings us closer to the Korea scenario. And this is what perhaps President Zelensky has a problem acknowledging. And some of his public diplomacy at the moment is not necessarily very helpful, in my opinion.
In the meantime, war crime after war crime, Russia is bombarding the civilian objects in Ukraine. And Steve Witkoff landed in Moscow again with his notebook in his hand. So what do you think is Witkoff and the Trump administration up to? Does it bring United States closer to business as usual with Russia?
Well, again, we hear a lot of stuff, but we have to keep some perspective and
like Nord Stream 2,
yes,
right?
Yes, let's unpack these things one after another. I think what Mr. Witkoff was this time charged with is, rather than, sweet talk Mr. Putin again about the business prospects and all of that and business as usual, he wants to know if Mr. Trump is going to get a ceasefire by the 100 days of his presidency or not. And is Putin prepared to stop bombing civilians, stop fighting on the front lines for at least 30 days? Because this was the initial proposal from the United States.
1 visit ago.
And Zelensky agreed to that 30-day pause in the fighting. Putin has so far said, yes, I'm in favor, but has done nothing. On the contrary, he intensified the attacks. So I think this time Mr. Witkoff is under much stricter instructions about what he needs to bring back from Moscow. So that's one thing. And when it comes to this business, restoring business ties and lifting sanctions, yes, I think Mr. Witkoff in particular is interested in that. He sees business prospects. But as we hear from many analysts, but also former investors in Russia, going back to business, we had Bill Browder, one of the largest investors in Russia in the past, and he's an anti-Putin campaigner now, urging sanctions and keeping Russia under pressure. And he was asked on our program, what advice would you give to Mr. Witkoff, who actually never did any business in Russia? And he said...
But who would very gladly do so.
Yes, and he said, stay away as far as you can, because Russia is a lawless state. And you cannot conduct business in a lawless state. So now going back to Nord Stream that you also mentioned, we also had a conversation about that, because there were reports in the press that the Americans are considering, as part of the sweeteners for Mr. Putin, they were considering reviving the Nord Stream pipeline. The White House denied that.
Yeah, there was a strong demand, that's true, by Marco Rubio.
But the main point is Germany, which is where the pipeline lands, is more or less ruled out restarting gas imports. And we had a senior member of the ruling Christian Democratic Party in Germany saying, no, we've learned our lesson. We're not going to become dependent on Russia again. So, these signals, some of these signals are signals, but there is not that much underneath. So we have to wait again and see if, because now Trump is going to face a choice. Either he takes whatever Putin offers him, and it may not be much, or he is going to decide to pile pressure on Russia. We haven't seen that much pressure on Russia so far. But, he can keep sanctions. The oil price is at $60 per barrel, which for Russia is tough because it's hard to finance their war effort with such low oil prices. And there may be other financial and other consequences. So for Putin, for both these main players, because I would insist that at the moment it's Trump and Putin who are the main players in this, it's a bit of a game of chicken.
Yes, well, Vitaly Klitschko also acknowledged that perhaps the concessions would have to be made. So indeed, the Ukrainians have a very tough decision ahead of them.
It's tough, and it's a test of their national, how should I say, their national resilience, because somewhere there will be unpleasant decisions to be made. And the question of whether the nation can stick together, and it has stuck together brilliantly over the past 3 years of war, bombardment, terrible conditions. But now comes the tricky part. And, I started by saying that perhaps some of the remarks by President Zelensky are not very helpful. They are understandable. Mm-hmm. He's under a lot of pressure. He's probably terrified. But some of his public statements, which seem to be berating the Americans and threatening to walk away on his part from any ceasefire, this is not necessarily very helpful at this stage, because he may need to prepare his nation to accept some unpleasant realities. And I think Mr. Klitschko, who is a potential rival to Zelensky in any future presidential election, that's why he's beginning to signal that to his countrymen.
Adam, let's move now to the Russian assets, the frozen Russian assets, which is another epopee. It's a long discussion about what to do with them. But apparently, a decision has to be made, and it has to be made quickly, as Foreign Minister of Estonia warns that Hungary blocks the decision to use them, and the central bank assets will be delivered to Russia shortly. So what can be done here with a veto from Hungary?
I think there are two issues here, and again, I had two conversations about this with policymakers and people involved in this week, and as our news channel has covered this extensively. So it seems to me that at this stage we are in a position where there is a small and shrinking number of countries in the EU which do not want to seize Russian assets, and we're talking about $200 billion worth of assets, because they're reluctant on legal grounds, let's say, that it would be illegal, or if it would be legal, then it means Europe is at war with Russia formally, which they don't want to go that path. And of course, Belgium, which holds most of these assets in a depository, doesn't want to be implicated directly, and they want to say this is a much more complicated issue than we think. Okay, this is their argument. But of course, the real argument is political. So if these assets are not confiscated, then they need to continue to be frozen by the EU. But in order to be frozen, the EU needs to make such a decision unanimously before July. Well, we don't know that. Orbán and Hungary folded before. Each time they were threatening not to agree to sanctions. In the end, they did. A lot will depend on what the Americans do and say. So, if Trump is really impatient with Putin and thinks Putin is not allowing the ceasefire, then he may prompt the Europeans to either seize the assets or to extend sanctions, in which case Hungary probably is not going to be going against Washington. So there is still, a bit of brinkmanship around this. But I think we have also heard enough from European capitals to realize that if it comes to worse, so let's say America walks away, or Ukraine is forced into a ceasefire which is really detrimental to its interests, and Hungary threatens to extend the sanction, to veto the extension of sanctions, then I think that a legal means of seizing these assets will be found by the EU.
I liked very much what Bill Browder wrote in his call to European leaders, saying that inaction is not neutrality, but complicity.
Yes.
And it's the time for the European Union to act, because it's all about its credibility.
Yes, and he also used a very interesting argument, which I haven't heard that much before, namely that, Europeans will face a choice, either to finance Ukraine reconstruction themselves at the huge cost to the European taxpayer, possibly even having to raise taxes, or they can use these assets. So, he said, to me, the choice is clear.
All right, and of course, lastly, Adam, the passing of Pope Francis this Monday has made headlines throughout the week. So the sad event constitutes also a very diplomatic event. I'm talking about the funeral tomorrow. So a conclave is to be held, and questions around the directions the Church is going to be heading remain. But politically, it wouldn't hurt to have another successor, a pope who would be more eager to point to the aggressor and to the victim than the Pope Francis, would it?
Yes, in some sense, Pope Francis, the late Pope Francis, who was, an open-minded, humble, and the kind of modern Christian that many young people would identify with, the friendly face of the institution, which sometimes had a history of being, to put it mildly, very conservative and orthodox on some issues.
Yes.
But on this Ukraine issue, he obviously couldn't get the right words to and I'm trying to be polite
Diplomatic.
now. And I think to a certain extent this may reflect the fact that he represents the global South. And we know that the global South countries have had an ambiguous approach to the war, very often siding with Russia to blame the West for its aggression on Ukraine. So maybe it's just maybe it's more cultural than anything else. So yes, you're right. Maybe some clarity from the leader of the Catholic Church would be needed on who the aggressor is. But, let's not forget that there are also other issues about the future of the Catholic Church that are important in the selection of his successor. Is the Church going to keep his more open-minded, tolerant agenda, again, towards other faiths, towards minorities?
Towards the divorce and the communion, for instance.
Correct.
Which is a very important
Or whether,
issue for
given
Christians.
that we are seeing, let's say, a global backlash, conservative backlash, you can easily call it that, whether the Church is also going to embrace that backlash and become, again, more conservative on issues. But anyway, we as TVP World, we will be covering this extensively tomorrow, the funeral, and in the days to come.
So Zelensky will be there, and Donald Trump is going to be there with Melania. They're very much looking forward to it, as we heard.
That's an awkward phrase to use.
That's true.
Looking forward to a funeral.
Thank you, Adam. And that's all we've prepared for you this time in this episode of Face to Face. Thank you once again for watching, and please stay tuned to TVP World for more news and commentary. See you soon.